Good afternoon, Noble. My name is Mitchell Davis. I'm the police chief in the village of Hazelcrest, which is right outside the south side of Chicago. I am your moderator today for our session that's titled America's Crisis in Policing, Race Relations, and the Duty to Uphold the 14th Amendment. I want to welcome you all to our virtual conference, and we've got some dynamic persons and presenters on this panel today, and they've got some tremendous information for us. So we're going to go ahead and get started. You actually can go online and find out more information about them. Because we only have an hour, we're not going to spend time on speaking on their bios. It would probably take up the entire hour when you see who we have on this panel. So I'm just grateful that they're here. I want to start things off by thanking two of our sponsors, our two sponsors for this session. We have Sayari Labs and Starbucks Coffee Company. And I believe we have some recorded comments from them that we're going to hear in just a second. All right, so we are not going to see those pre-recorded videos. We're going to just proceed. So I'm going to start off with an introduction to our panelists. First person I want to introduce is a chief, and I had to ask her, is she chief doctor, Dr. Chief? And she said it kind of depends on the setting. So I'm going to start off by doing what she told me to do. Her name is RaShall Brackney, and she's a PhD, and she's the chief of police for Charlottesville Police Department. We've all heard of Charlottesville, and she's doing some tremendous things, and she's here to help us out and give us some insight today. We also have former Mayor Marc Morial, President and CEO of the National Urban League. We have Dr. Tracie Keesee. She's a Senior Vice President of Social Initiatives and co-founder of the Center for Policing Equity. We have Dr. Kimberley Richards. She's a core trainer and organizer for the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And finally, we have Kenith Bergeron, the federal mediator, senior conciliation specialist for the U.S. Department of Justice Community Relations Service. So I want to welcome them. Once again, we have a power-packed panel, and we're going to bring them on screen right now so we can get moving. All right, welcome panelists. We're gonna remember we got everything worked out, so we're gonna go ahead and dive right in. I'm gonna start off by having each one of you take about 2 minutes. Take about 2 minutes and just describe the crisis in policing as it exists right now from your perspective. And we're gonna start with the ladies. Dr. Richards, can you start off a couple minutes letting us know what your perspective is on the crisis that exists?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chief. Good afternoon, everyone. Noble in your membership. First, I just want to recognize the work and the importance, especially during this time, that organizations like Noble can play. I think the crisis is rooted in our nation's history and the history of policing, and that we're at a time, we live in a nation that is based and built on the imposition of the ideology of race. And policing in this country has a history in that racial arrangement. And so our crisis is the crisis not only in policing. You know, many times the police get charged or having to wear or carry the weight of the ills of our entire society. So it is not just a crisis in policing, it is a crisis in this nation, that we in this nation, that we are invited. Hopefully we will take the opportunity to really understand the imposition of the ideology of race. You know, the late Dr. Francis Cress Welsing said that if you take the letters that we use to spell the word America, America, and if you mix those letters up, you will get the phrase, I am race. We are a nation built on the imposition of that ideology. And it's not just the police force, but the whole concept of policing that happens in every institution is rooted in a history that saw me and people who look like me and those of us on this panel as property. And so when police forces are charged to protect and serve, that whole phrase was developed at a time when we were seen as property and not fully as human beings. So the challenge, I think, for all of our institutions, including police, is how we can be in a sustained conversation to understand the racialization process and how that racialization process is dehumanized and dehumanizing, and how we have to develop programs, policies, and procedures that elevate humanity.
Thank you so much, Doctor. We appreciate you. We're going to go to one of our other doctors next. How about Dr. Chief Dr. Brackney?
Thank you, Chief Davis, soon to be Dr. Chief Davis as well. So we're going to speak that into existence. As I grappled with this concept of what was the current crisis in policing, what I quickly came to understand is it wasn't a current crisis. This is a crisis that we have been dealing with for the past 400 years, in which law enforcement and policing in particular has been complicit in both its conscious and its culture of how we engage with minority communities. And more specifically, we were founded on the principles of us versus them. And now that warrior mentality has surfaced in the modern 21st century in a way that the society is saying this is no longer acceptable. In fact, the current crisis is a demand to renegotiate that social contract and that social construct as we dismantle the culture of policing to one that now requires that we participate in a servant mentality and a relational policing in which there is a co-production of public safety and no longer just a single authoritarian perspective in policing. This current crisis will continue and will resurface decades after decades, centuries after century, if we don't dismantle not only the master's house using the master's tools, but also using the master's mentality in which the current state of law enforcement was constructed under, i.e. built out of slave patrols, built out of social and economic economies in which law enforcement was used and utilized in order to put individuals in their place and maintain that socioeconomic status. So for me, the current crisis is a crisis that we've been grappling with for more than 400 years, and it's up to us collectively to elevate the conscious and the culture, or elevate the conscious and the complicity so we change the culture.
Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate that great insight. Let's move to Dr. Keesee.
Thank you. And all I can start with is preach, sisters. Oh, my goodness. I'm trying to get caught up here. So I'm going to bring in the 14th Amendment, if I could, because that's part of our conversation. If we all remember, as a part of Reconstruction efforts, slaves were granted citizenship, or personhood, as most of us like to call it. And along with that came a set of protections. For those of us who are trying to remember our government, the 14th Amendment claims, of course, that no state shall deprive any person of liberty or property without due process or deny equal protection under the law. Yet here we are 152 years later, almost to the day. The 14th Amendment was passed on July 28th, 1868. And we are again having this conversation because folks are unwilling or maybe unable to grasp the concepts of equal protection and due process when it pertains to Black folks. The crisis in policing, from my perspective, are as follows, and of course not limiting for those of you who know who I am. One, what is the role of police today? End of story. What is the role of police today? Two, can systems that at its core were built on the notion of maintaining white supremacy and which are currently operating as designed be reformed? Or is abolishment the only way to get to true change and equitable public safety? Number three, police have yet to fully admit, accept, and reconcile that race is a prevailing factor in the approach, outcomes, and deadly outcomes when it comes to who to protect and serve. Number four, police are only one actor in a large system, and we truly miss the mark if we don't identify and understand how we intersect with other social structures. And we do this, we compound the inequities. We must disentangle ourselves while simultaneously leading the charge and focusing on Black communities. And my last one, policing must also recognize and address the unique position of Black officers and Black chiefs, and understanding that we are all blue is just another version of all lives matter. We are the only group of people who are asked to make false choices between our profession and our community. And I must also clearly state, recognizing the extraordinary challenges of those of us who are at the intersection of race, gender, queer, and non-conforming. I look forward to the conversation.
Wow. This is great golf to a great start here. I told you we had some heavyweights with us today, and we're gonna round things up with this little introductory part by I don't know if to call him mayor, whether to call him CEO, whether to call him president, but we have Mr. Marc Morial, who's the president and CEO of the National Urban League. Welcome, sir, and we want
Thank
to get
you.
your perspective of what you think things are going on.
Thank you very much, Chief Davis. And I am just so honored to be with three bold and bodacious sisters, brilliant too, who've just broken down this analysis, I think, in a very precise way. Uh, Let me add this. We are experiencing today a backlash against whatever progress we've made in the last 50 years of unprecedented proportions. Over the weekend, a United States Senator by the name of Tom Cotton, a Harvard law grad who represents Arkansas, stated that, quote unquote, slavery was necessary in the development of the United States. Can you imagine that a high ranking US Senator would go so far in 2020 as to seek to defend the peculiar institution of oppression and repression of Black people, the system of American slavery, which was defeated in the Civil War, but what was continued as slavery light, segregation, and institutional racism up until now. So we're facing in this moment, when you see a federal government, you see a president of the United States without a request from a mayor or a governor, sending in quote unquote federal troops to quote protect public buildings, but really to make war and violence on peaceful protesters. When you see a United States Department of Justice which decides on its own motion that it will not enforce civil rights laws, it will not enforce civil rights laws by refusing to conduct pattern and practice investigations into police misconduct. When you see a history by prosecutors across the land, state and federal prosecutors, to refuse to bring criminal charges against offensive police officers, brutal police officers, murderous police officers. When you see a United States Senate literally sit on its hands after the United States House of Representatives has passed a comprehensive reform bill called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, you know that this moment that we are in, is a moment of great fragility. We are the generation today that has to fight this battle with everything that we have, every single thing that we have, because our progress, however we view it, is being threatened. Our humanity is being threatened. Our dignity is being threatened, and our lives are being challenged. They're being challenged. So at this moment, we have to take up this cause to reimagine what the systems of public safety and community health ought to be like in our communities, our urban communities, our suburban communities, our rural communities, big and small. We've got to take up this cause and be part of both the analysis and the diagnosis, but the prescriptions for comprehensive and meaningful change. That is the moment that we are in. What I'm confident of is that within our community and amongst our allies, we have talent, we have knowledge, we have know-how, we have brilliance. Our challenge is to marshal that and to have, whether you call it nerve, determination, passion, political skill, community organizing ability, whatever it takes. This moment has to become a movement. You know, when George Floyd was murdered on the streets of Minneapolis. It was all of us saying enough is enough. Remember, it came behind Ahmaud Arbery. It came behind Breonna Taylor. It came behind a long list since Trayvon Martin was murdered of acts of violent injustice against mostly African-American men, but not exclusively African-American men. And we indicated, and the outrage in the streets across the world said enough is enough. But we cannot allow this to simply be a moment where all we said was we were outraged and we were angry and we reacted. We've got to make sure the moment becomes a movement for systemic and comprehensive reimagination of change. It isn't an easy job. It isn't a job. It isn't something that is done by a sweeping law, one sweeping law. It isn't done by 6 months worth of work. We have to turn this directionally and then sustain new momentum. So I am so proud of Noble. So proud of Noble.
Thank you so much,
for its willingness to stand up and step up.
I warned everybody. We got some heavy hitters here. I warned everybody. Wow, that's a great start. Thank you all for that. I'm going to give our audience a little overview as to, we gave some introduction here, but I'm going to give a little overview on our subject matter. In 2020, we are experiencing an avalanche of demands to address issues of police violence. There are ongoing national and international demonstrations that oppose unjustified citizen deaths at the hands of law enforcement officers in the United States. Historically, police agencies have been used as a major form of social control and viewed as a major tool of racial oppression against Black and brown communities. African Americans are yet to realize the full protections of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Law enforcement could serve as guardians or violators of the 14th Amendment. This panel will review the nature of the crisis in policy, race relations, and what needs to happen to achieve true citizenship and long deferred justice for people of color. So we just heard an introduction, and man, like I said, I'm just honored to be amongst such great folks. And it's just a blessing to have these fighters and folks that are out here who are both inside and outside of the law enforcement profession that bring their perspectives, but all for common good, And, it's been a blessing for me to be a part of this process also. Some of you may remember a couple of conferences ago, I did a class on leadership in law enforcement from a Black chief's perspective. And that class was way before what happened now. I made it a few years ago, but it addresses these specific things on bringing light to our comrades and to our cohorts that don't look like us, to try to get them to empathize with what we as Black folks go through on a daily basis as a matter of systemic racism. So we're going to go to the first question, and I'm going to have a couple of you all address this question. I'm going to have the good chief address this one, and how about Dr. Richards also address this one. The first question is going to be, how does equal protection under the law become realized for citizens regardless of one's race, economic, or social status in the United States? How does equal protection under the law become realized for citizens regardless of one's race, economic, or social status in the United States? And Chief, you can go ahead and start with that.
So thank you. Dr. Keesee, she set it up for me perfectly, actually, when she was talking about that this has been a long and systemic movement that we've built inequities on, right, and inequalities on. The first thing I would say is that we really have to dig deep into the 14th Amendment. There's a portion of it that we really don't talk a lot about. When Black codes were set up, when we were thinking about Jim Crow laws and things of that nature. There's a portion of the 14th Amendment that specifically says that legislature or we have the ability to we should not make or enforce any law which shall abridge privileges or immunities of our communities, of our citizens, right? And we have been, as I started out by saying, we have been complicit as a law enforcement community by failing to acknowledge that we have did exactly what we've been mandated not to do. We've abridged those. We've enforced those laws that said that we had no authority, really, either as a moral authority or the authority that would have been given to us from society to do. And we have to take a stand to say that we will no longer participate or be complicit in these type of actions. What I would say is that would require a cultural shift within law enforcement. We talk about reform, we talk about reformation, we talk about dismantling, defunding, and reconstruction. Well, we have all of those things in place now. We have all the policies in place. We have the ability to implement them. The problem is we've never been able to address the culture on which law enforcement was built on. It was built on an us versus them mentality. Slave patrols were put into place not just to control the slaves who were moving or attempting to escape. They were put in place to intimidate, to terrorize, and to control behaviors of those slaves or those enslaved persons to their masters. So being built on a culture that was your foundational principles, there's no way that in our current mandates we can escape that unless we change the culture. We have enough training, we have enough laws, we have enough of all of the other constitutional and legal parameters by which we should operate. But for Black folk, as I'm going to put it, to fully realize that we have to use and hold the entire system accountable. Reimagining a criminal justice system that has never been just for people who look like us. I think we have to move away from what does reimagining look like, but how do we then renegotiate what that contract looks like, and how we renegotiate those powers and what we're doing to dismantle the entire system that was built on a premise that we should not be enforcing these laws, but if you don't look like I look, it's easy to dehumanize you and enforce laws and treat you in a way that you don't fully realize the potentials that have been granted to you by the Constitution.
Wow, great insight.
Chief Davis, yeah. May I add something?
Absolutely, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to add the following. The 14th Amendment, if you read the 14th Amendment, it is a powerful constitutional document. But the effort to undercut the 14th Amendment began soon after the 14th Amendment was adopted. Way back in the 1870s, the Reconstruction Congress passed a civil rights law. I believe it was in 1875. That civil rights law was substantially declared unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court in 1883, I believe it was. So the effort to undercut, and the law passed by Congress was a law to enforce the 14th Amendment, and it enumerated various things in various areas in which racial discrimination was banned. And essentially, what the Supreme Court said is that the 14th Amendment was limited to governmental action, and that Congress could not regulate against private discrimination. And if you read the 14th Amendment, it says nothing of the sort. It was the beginning of this political effort to overturn the results of the Civil War of the 1860s. Fast forward to 1896. And in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson case, of course, brought by Homer Plessy and backed by a citizens committee in my hometown of New Orleans. When they brought that case, they did not imagine that the Supreme Court of the United States would uphold a local ordinance which required separate seating on commuter trains. And they lost. And once again, the Supreme Court steps in to undercut the dictates of the 14th Amendment. Today, we are in an environment where once again, the Supreme Court has undercut the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which in effect was based on both the 14th and the 15th Amendments. This effort to protect the 14th Amendment, but the war on the 14th Amendment, the absolute political war to knock out the 14th Amendment's effect, is a 100 plus, almost 150-year-old effort. I just add the context that in today's time, in today's world, it is why the protest movements we see, utilizing every power and effect of the First Amendment to peacefully assemble, is essential. Why ensuring that that protest movement finds its way into the ballot boxes and into the voting booths of America this fall is essential. But beyond that, why continued protest, why continued activism at every level is essential, because we are in a period where the assault on the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, when leaders of the United States and the president or elected leaders defend a Confederate flag, defend a statue of Lee or a statue of Davis, or defend the names of Confederate generals on U.S. Army bases, they're in effect saying the 13th Amendment means nothing in modern
What's also
America.
interesting about this whole process is the defenses that are going on. First Amendment, Second Amendment, people they're defending that, but they're selectively defending what they want.
They pick the piece of the Constitution they want. When they say Second Amendment, I say first, I say 13th, I say 14th, I say 15th.
Absolutely.
When they say second, 1, 13, 14, and 15 is what we need to say. You say the Second Amendment, then you need to embrace these other amendments too.
So we're going to move on. We're going to do a little flip-flop in here. We're going to be adapt and adjust, and we're going to move on to our second question, and I'm going to have that one started off by Dr. Richards. Dr. Richards, that second question that we're going to ask you and Dr. Keesee to address is, what policing and or criminal justice reforms are you advocating for, and how do we secure them? Once again, what policing and or criminal justice reforms are you advocating for, and how do we secure them? Dr. Richards, you can go ahead and get started. I think you're on mute, Doc. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Such a powerful panel as this, and the energy and the questions that we're seeing and feeling in our families and communities. You know, I just want to go back to something that Chief Brackney said. There is a culture. There is a culture that is in this country and that is in police forces all over this country that we really don't want to often talk about. And that is the culture of white supremacy. Every institution in this country was built at a time when white supremacy was the law of the land, which is why every system and institution, you can basically determine what the outcomes are going to be based on someone's race. So as we talk about, you know, for me, reform is just moving the chairs around in the room, and the structure and the nature of that room doesn't change. But what I'm not looking for is police reform, but a transformation of a culture of white supremacy that allows many of us to want to look at policing and law enforcement of our own children, our own communities, in ways that we have contorted around even what safety is. That there's a culture in this country and a way that we think about just equal protection. You know, the last question talked about equal protection. This country was developed at a time where the law of the land was that my humanity was only seen as 3/4. That 3/5, that ideology is present in every institution. And so for me, the transformation is a part of the work that I do is around undoing racism. And so we've got to be able to undo the culture. We've got to be able to look at what that culture has done to us in terms of how we see ourselves, how we see people who look like us, how many times we will be in a position and we are much more loyal to that position than we are the organizing that got us there. Because for us to be in positions that we as African Americans are in today, it took people to protest, to picket, to march, and to die. And many times they did that with the prayer and the hope that we would then do the transformational work that created a equal, if you will, playing field or a culture that elevated humanity. And many times that undoing means that we've got to look many times at those of us that are in leadership roles, those of us that are public servants, that where is our loyalty? Is our loyalty to a history that has not been about our humanity? Or is our loyalty really to the transformation that is going to elevate us all? So for me, the question around the criminal justice system and transformations are, we lay at the feet of the criminal justice system to do things that other systems and institutions should be doing. So how do we really in our communities, and how do we in the Black community have a conversation around what has happened to us and what we have done to either benefit from an arrangement that always keeps white on top, that some of us don't even want to talk about racism in terms of, we know that if you've got white at the top, then Black anchors it at the bottom. There have been times when it's been indigenous people who have anchored it at the bottom. How we can in our communities really talk about the ways that institutional and structural racism show up when it's just us. How do we talk about the feet of oppression? How do we talk about even the intersectionality that we as Black women and how we interface with Black men, and how a culture has been created where we don't often talk about intersectionality, that those are the kinds of transformations. Because if we are not transformed, systems won't transform. As one of the other panelists said already, we've got the laws, we've got the amendments, we've got the policies. We now have the opportunity in our communities to transform the way we've been socialized to see each other and to deal with each other and to deal with those of us who may be at different stations or classes in the Black community and genders and the queer community. When that transformation happens in our communities, that's when then we can organize in a collective way to then transform the systems and institutions that have been feet of oppression in our lives.
Woo, man. I warned you before we got started. Wow, that was great.
Right?
I got my notes here. I've been taking notes, and
Yeah.
I heard the chief talk about it a moment ago, and we talk about cultures, that culture within law enforcement, that culture that exists in so many different institutions. And I think lately we've all been hearing that saying that and somebody already mentioned it about a policy being put into place, but we've been hearing that saying that a culture eats policy for lunch.
That's right. That's right.
So unless we address culture, we can do all the policy we want to, and nothing's going to change. So I want to take a moment and welcome our final distinguished guest, and we're going to give him a chance to speak in just a moment. But Mr. Kenith Bergeron, thank you for being here, sir. We're going to have you speak in just a moment, but right now we're going to have Dr. Keesee give us her insight on what policing and/or criminal justice reforms are you advocating for, and how do we secure them?
Thank you, Dr. Richards. I don't even know how you began to follow what you just said, because it was on point all over the place. I mean, I was snapping. You couldn't see me. I was off screen. But I struggle with the word reform, and I think I'm struggling like most chiefs and most officers of color around this particular space and moment about what do we do. I am for the complete investment of Black communities, and that means that this is also an investment in how they determine what public safety looks like, feels like, and is delivered. And so if we take a moment and we sort of just step back and listen to the conversations that are happening around us, there is some richness in there, but there's also some fear and some self-protection happening in this same space. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to really think about and be mindful of is, unless what happens next is at the center of and directed by community, I agree 100% with my colleagues. we will be rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, for lack of a better analogy. And so I think when we talk about what reforms are we advocating with, I struggle with the word reform. I don't think that's what we're talking about here, and I don't think that's what community is asking of us. I think what the community has so aptly articulated is that they are done with reforms and incrementalism. In the last 150 odd years, best practices that have been practiced on us for centuries. And so I think that if we do not come to the table honestly as officers, chiefs, and all of those folks who are responsible for creating legislation, as well as, you know, implementing, training, if we don't have these conversations now about what is it we could be doing, should be doing, and what we should not be doing, then again, we will miss the mark in this particular space. I think for me, where I struggle the most is around the issue of whether or not policing is necessary and needed at all. We are still struggling, as most cities are, with a rise in violent crime, which is also a symptom of other things that have happened historically. But we still have to figure out, is there a space for some type of policing, some type of law enforcement? And I think that's going to be the most difficult position to be in. I think that we have enough examples in our own communities of things that are working and not working. We have tons of nonprofits who do this work in the space, violence disruptors, people who help with historical trauma, which is another thing that whatever this is has to address. And it's too often that those folks on the ground closer to the work are the ones that get the least amount of funding, or they're scrambling over so few dollars. So I'm not quite yet ready to answer what does it look like. I think that is something we still are in the early conversations of having. It's hard to do when a nation is grieving. And I think that as we move forward, in order to secure anything, you have to deal with the issues of inequity. And the inequities are playing out loud and clear. We see this, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I don't know, most of us don't forget about that, but we look at the disparities in those numbers. We look at the disparities in unemployment, the disparities in housing. And so how we intersect with those social sectors and how we disentangle ourselves is a process yet that I've seen fully articulated and demonstrated. And so we have a ways to go, but I say I am for reforms that remembers the community is at the center and must be driving it, and whatever that looks like. And that also requires that we as law enforcement and those of us in government power have the patience to let that play out. Because what I'm feeling right now is this need to rush through a very uncomfortable moment for lots of people in order to serve up what we believe the solution should be for this, and that doesn't work for me. So I'll just say that loud and clear, that does not work for me. So I think as we try to answer those questions, we have to think about how do we support the community in being able to bring what they want to the table. Because once again, we're in a moment where we can dismiss it because it's not organized the way we would necessarily organize it, or there isn't a white paper in the way that we would necessarily do that. And so I think that it is important that we as Black law enforcement officers sit with community and help them articulate what it is they need and want, and make sure that we do that in a way in which we all took oaths to protect and serve our own. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you so much for that great insight. So we're going to move on to our third question, and we're going to have our Department of Justice person answer that question and address it first. And then our next question, Mr. Bergeron, is going to be, as demonstrations are happening in communities of all demographics, how do we maintain the momentum and engagement of all stakeholders to achieve meaningful change? I'll let you address that, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chief, for having me on the panel. And Noble, it's good to see some of the familiar faces that you have. And when you get freed up in Hazelcrest, I'll come out and see you.
All right.
With respect to the issues of community involvement, what we notice in the Community Relations Service is a continuing need to have the community involved in dialogue, to have a collective voice and input about how people want public safety or policing to be administered to them. And without that voice and that involvement, then you really wind up with a top-down system as you as we continue to see across the country. Of course, coming with the Department of Justice and the voice that I'm speaking, representative of the agency, I've got to give it to you from our perspective. What it looks really like is an effort to try to involve communities in a dialogue with policing. So we have a number of programs to bring people out to a table and get their voice through action planning and working groups and written agreements on how those things work. Some of these pieces, or the pieces that I've noticed that work well, are the ones that have sustainability. Here in Chicago, as you know, Chief Mitchell, COPA and the Chicago Police Department exist. And I think what we hear is an outcry of community that want to have accountability of officers and about their behaviors. My problem that I often see is that there is not necessarily a measurable lens, or there's not an opportunity for the community to be able to see how those accountability factors are meted out. And so even the COPAs or the police advisory commissions that we set, or any kind of oversight bodies, have to allow the community to see how they're working, and then allow the community to be surveyed so that their voice is continually reflected back on how they see those accountability factors brought forward. So the absence of dialogue, the closed lens, or the wall of silence in police departments oftentimes give rise to some of the things that you see. But of course, along with the structural pieces of structural racism and department, the lack of training, the lack of departments that actually do outreach and the community policing efforts that don't encompass everybody, those give rise to problems. So what I would say for in answer to this question is to try to find ways to create community programs. We have Strengthening Police Community Partnerships in our agency, which is a program that really allows the community to indicate the problems and the feelings that they have with the department, and then to talk about how prioritize what they want to see in terms of change, and then come out with action planning surrounding that. So there just has to be a continuing effort of allowing people to have voice about how they want to be policed.
Thank you, sir. And a common theme that I'm hearing here is something that I truly believe in also, just as Dr. Keesee was just saying, that we got to have the community as part of it. We've already, law enforcement has historically decided how it was going to interact with the community without any involvement from the community. And any healthy relationship, you have to get input from both folks. That even if you're well intended, your good intentions may not end up the way that you want them to, because you're trying to feed somebody strawberries that can't stand strawberries, even though you love strawberries. So that involvement is key. So we're getting close to our time, but we're going to take a couple questions here. We got a question from the chat, and I heard somebody, it might have been Dr. Richards, talk on this already. So she might be one of the people to address this, but if somebody else wants to jump in, you can also. So Dr. Sophine Charles wants to know, what is undoing racism? What does that look like? What does that mean? What does that look like? I think I heard somebody mention that. It might have been Dr. Richards, but I'm not sure.
Yes, it was. Yes. For us, undoing racism, again, as I stated earlier, we live in a race-based society, and that society has really shaped our socialization and conditioning. So undoing racism first gives us a way to look at how we've all been socialized and conditioned. It gives us a way to really remember those who have historically been left out. So as Dr. Keesee has said, many times we develop policy and programs for people and they are not at the table, and many talk about the phrase, anything for me without me is not really best for me. And so undoing racism allows us to really honestly look at what has been done in terms of the history of this country and the outcomes and the impact. And it allows us to do organizing that's guided by what we call humanistic or anti-racist organizing principles. One is how we learn from history. Two, how we develop leadership that is accountable. 3, how we understand that the impact that the racialization has had on all human beings lessens our humanity. And when we really look at the messages of superiority and inferiority, how collectively they create an oppression that makes equal protection impossible. We look at what it takes to, we look at militarism, not just policing, but militarism in every system and institution, and the role that policing plays to ensure and maintain that. We look at our role as gatekeepers. What are we protecting and who are we protecting and who are we keeping in and who are we letting out? How do we as gatekeepers who are African Americans, how are we used to represent a system and institution that may not be about our own humanity? So the role of undoing racism really helps us look what has been done to each of us and what is the organizing that we must do to undo first what's happened to us and how that shows up in every system and institution. So it's about community organizing and doing that with a set of humanistic principles.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. We got another question, and I'll maybe send this to our mayor over there, or president, CEO. We got a question from Miss Alvarez that says, how do we address white superiority in institutions and its impact on community? How do we address white superiority in institutions and its impact on community?
You know, it's not an easy question. How do you impact it? How do you do it in an effective way? I think that the previous question and the previous answer is the way to do it. And that is by people participating in undoing racism, training, and analysis, because you can't undo white supremacy until you undo the mindset and the systems and the attitudes that not only create it, but continue to sustain it. So I think if you think of yourselves as police leaders, and you think about, because if I was in my previous job and I was thinking about this, I would be thinking about, okay, what steps do I need to take? What steps can I take with the personnel, with the system as it is, to engineer this cultural change that we all know is needed? It affects the pillar to the post in a department. It certainly affects how you hire, how you deploy, how you prepare, how you train, how you discipline. It affects every single element. But how would you get started? How would you do it? Do you embed undoing racism, anti-racism analysis in how you hire, in how you prepare, beginning with the first day in the police academy? The challenge is, when we think about systematic change, is where do you start? How do you execute? How do you pull it off? Because if I'm a mayor and a political leader that wants to do it, where do I start? How do I do it? I got a 4-year term. Maybe I get a chance to get reelected once because I'm term limited. If I really, really want to make this happen. And I think that's the question of guidance that I think would be very helpful from frontline law enforcement executives, from an organization, from Noble. But this issue of, and I'll tell you, I should just, this is such a fascinating personal reflection, and I'll just share it with you all for a minute. Last Saturday, I got a personal letter from someone I was in middle school with. Mind you, when I went to school, the middle school I attended, there were only 2 Black students in the entire school, and there were no Black students in my class. This was a letter of apology from a white boy, now a white man, who apologizes to me 50 years later for, quote unquote, bullying me racially and bullying the Black students racially 50 years ago. But what was so stunning is, in the letter, he said that the Black Lives Matter movement had caused him to completely, this is him saying this, re-examine how he looked at things and how he acted And he said, he didn't leave a return address. He said, I don't want anything. You've turned out to be a far better man than I have. But I just want you to know, in effect, he's obviously clearing his conscience. But the point is that it's a reflection on the impact of now on the attitudes that drive white supremacy. And I think we have to seize this moment and really, really figure out how we can dismantle the mindset and the attitudes that sustain white supremacy. I work in the policy space. That's another track. But someone said earlier, I think you said it, Chief, culture eats policy. So how do we change the culture of white supremacy? And I think the question for law enforcement leaders who want to change it is, what's the roadmap? What's the blueprint? What are the steps you can take?
If I could.
Absolutely. We're going to let you close us out here. So we'll go right ahead.
Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't know that was going to be the honor. But so first of all, Mayor, thanks for sharing that story. And I think that yours is probably shared by a couple of other people who all of a sudden realized that what they had done was not right. And I appreciate folks who have that recognition now. The damage has been done. And where I'm struggling with is, as I look at the questions popping up, right? And I'm watching businesses all of a sudden in their runners on their website saying Black Lives Matter. I'm watching, policy just flying through legislators on the state level. And, and maybe it's just me, but I'm the one asking why now? What's happening now was no different than it was when I first started in policing 30 years ago. The voice was no different. The cries, the pain were no different than what's happening today. And so when we talk about next steps, the next steps in which we should all be doing, and I do this work, and I know, my colleagues who I work with do this, is that you have thousands of police officers on the ground who have no clue what's happening right now. What they know is what the union tells them. What they know is what they see on TV, depending on which channel you're watching.
That's right.
And there is yet to be an internal conversation with lots of our folks on the ground who are dealing with this, right? You're not chiefs, not that I don't love my chiefs, but you're not answering those calls. You're not standing on that skirmish line necessarily. But that's the thing that's missing for me, part of it. And so even as though we have folks who maybe, the veil might be lifted, they woke, whatever words you want to choose, the people who need to really understand what's happening are the people who are affecting what is going on today. And they don't. I talk to thousands of officers, and this includes Black officers as well, who do not understand why folks are in the street in this moment of time. And so police departments and folks who work with them or partner with them would really help them to benefit if they understood, one, what was going on and what their role historically has been in this moment, find a common language to be able to help them understand. As the chief has mentioned, understand why this uniform is still very complicit in what's happened historically, and it's not all about you personally and not all about you, we calling you racist. Those to me are those initial steps that have to happen, and it's not happening because I took calls this morning from people who watch panels or can't understand why people are in the street. That's disturbing to me.
Yes.
That is really disturbing to me, and that's I'll end with that. Start with our own house. If we want to teach somebody how to do and learn, start with your own house, and then you can move out to the community.
And Chief, before you end this, as a person who's sitting in that space, we need to be very clear about our language. Call it what it is. We soften it and call it racism. It's anti-Blackness. So let's call it what it is. Let's come to a shared understanding of how we've been indoctrinated into a system and how we then undo that cultural brainwashing so that we can move forward. And that's very intentional in our language and intentional in our conversations and intentional in our actions. I know we have running up against some sponsorships, so I don't want to mess with our sponsors.
Don't mess with the money.
You're on mute, Chief.
I'm unmuted?
No.
Davis.
I'm sorry.
What are we talking about here?
I said that was a drop the mic. That was a drop the mic statement. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. You all, I warned everybody before we got started that this was a power-packed panel and that 1 hour could not even come close to giving it justice and giving their great insight justice. But I want to thank you all for spending time. Our panel today, America's Crisis in Policing, Race Relations, and a Duty to Uphold the 14th Amendment. So I want to thank our sponsors again, Sayari Labs and Starbucks Coffee. And Starbucks Coffee is going to close us out with just a little bit about their company. I want to thank everybody and have a great day. Make sure
Thank you.
Well,
and vote in.
Hi, I'm Kevin Johnson, CEO of Starbucks, and we are proud to be a sponsor of Noble's 44th Annual Training Conference. And on behalf of all of us at Starbucks, I'd like to thank Noble for your ongoing partnership, especially during this trying time in our communities. It is more important than ever to find ways to work together and find solutions that move our communities forward. And over the years, together we have hosted conversations in our communities across the country where law enforcement officials and the community can meet and discuss public safety interests, as well as share experiences to foster greater understanding and empathy. We've had more than 1,500 of these conversations that are critical in creating understanding and healing divides. We wish you all success in your meeting over the next few days, and we remain committed to working together. We know all too well how much our store partners depend on you and your colleagues to keep our communities safe, and we thank you. We thank you for your service to our communities.